So my name's Peter. I'm from the Green Futures Network at the University of Exeter. I'm really pleased that we have Carlotta Sanz from the Doughnut Economics Action Lab joining us. And this session is all about positive tipping points in practice and looking at what are the tipping points for doughnut economics becoming the norm across the world. So we'll go into a bit more detail about what that means in practice. The first half of the session is going to be very much around introducing this idea of positive tipping points, then hearing from Carlotta a bit of the context around doughnut economics, and then the second half we'll do more in a kind of a workshop format with a couple of breakout rooms, giving you the opportunity to really get into this positive tipping points framework and play around with the idea. And then we'll wrap that up at the end and think about where we go from here and any next steps. I'll share all of the links and the ideas that come up throughout in the follow-up email. So feel free to take notes if that helps you, but don't worry about you losing out on anything if you don't. So to make a start, I'm just going to start with a bit of a Mentimeter poll. This is just to get a sense of who's here and the different perspectives, and get us start thinking about doughnut economics through this lens of tipping points. So I'm going to share a link in the chat. So you can either click on that link or use a phone or a tablet if you've got one to hand or something like that, and go to menti.com and enter that 8-digit number. And I'm going to share my screen. And what you'll get is a series of questions, which we'll answer together in turn. Really, so we can just get a sense of the different perspectives we have. These are all completely anonymous, so really don't feel like anyone's going to have to justify anything they say. It's really just to get a sense of different ideas. If you can't access the Mentimeter poll for any reason, please do feel free to put your answers in the chat. If you have just joined us, you can see the joining information at the top of the screen there. So this first question is, what do you think of when you hear the phrase tipping points? We've already got a reference to the awful game show Tipping Points, so I'm glad we've got that out of the way at the beginning. But a few other ideas here. So climate and change coming up, this idea of a point of no return. Change is a bit of a regular theme emerging here. New direction, new system state. So this idea of change, of something being new, accelerating. We've got different types of change: social change, climate breakdown, transformation, momentum, accelerating. So a lot of really ideas relating to movement and to change. Thanks, Maria, in the chat. Empty homes as an opportunity. Another some specific ideas that could be coming up here. Cliff edge is an interesting one as well, which could have quite clear connotations. Opportunity as well. So there's positive and negative perspectives on this idea of tipping points, which we will absolutely get to. Just another few seconds, and there's a few people who've just joined. So if you have, we're just doing this Mentimeter poll. I'll put the link in the chat once again for those of you who've just joined, and you can join in as we go. So I'll move on to question number 2, which is, how did you first hear about doughnut economics? So this is, I just picked 5 fairly random options and an other. If you select other, there's an opportunity to put a comment in as well, and so please do add the details. This is really just to get a sense of how information is spreading, which is going to be one of the themes around this idea of tipping points, is really thinking about how does information spread, how do new ideas emerge. So please do feel free to add a comment if you've selected other, which seems to be the kind of the dominant option at the moment from a colleague. Absolutely. So that's definitely one of the options here. So there's a pretty good spread here. Interestingly, that no one selected from the news or the kind of forms.
That's just more.
Getting a bit of background noise, so please do forgive me if I'm just going to mute everybody there, just to make sure that everybody can hear just fine. Great. Okay, so that's really useful to think. So again, we'll reflect back on this on how information spreads, and thanks to everyone who's shared comments around where they've been hearing about these ideas. So different people, different kind of media. Okay, next question. So big picture here, and this might be a bit of a difficult question, but I would invite your immediate responses to this. What would happen if donut economics was the default model across the world, in every single context it could possibly be applied to, what would happen? What would that look like? What would that feel like? What would that mean to you? So again, there's really no right or wrong answer here, but just to get some ideas of, if we're talking about tipping into a new way of being, into a new state, it's good to have some idea of what that feels like, what that looks like, what that means to us. And there might be some commonality in these ideas. There might be some contradiction. Again, there is no right or wrong answer here. So there's a few ideas emerging already, these being about better lives, fairness, sustainable living, parity, safe and just. So definitely some themes. Someone who's not familiar with donut economics, which is absolutely fine. Carlotta will talk a little bit about what that is in a little bit. So don't worry that if you're behind on that. Again, fairness coming into this quite a lot. Systems change. Crucially, so that's in all sorts of ways, politically, economically, socially, less big business. Okay, so yeah, a really specific example of what that can mean. People being healthier, able to flourish, raised awareness, community sectors all joined up, reference model for the future, thriving, slowing down, focus beyond gross domestic product and growth, economic values changing, being more realigned to human life and well-being. An end of rampant capitalism, reorganization of how society prioritizes actions and investments. Okay, so some really interesting, some really specific ideas, some more general ideas. But thanks, Maria, in the chat. Systemic changes being very connected. So lots of different ideas here. Yes, I'd be so happy. Great. So we need those kind of emotional reactions as well as the ones we might see, the practical changes as part of that. That's a big part of what makes up what can tip something from one state to another. And joy, absolutely. So a real mix of emotions, of practical ideas, and bigger concepts. So I'm sure we could continue on. We could spend 2 hours talking about this question, and that would be a lovely use of our time. But I'm going to move us on to another question. Is okay. So what is creating momentum for donut economics being used more widely? What are you seeing that is helping the spread of this idea? And again, if you're not familiar with the idea, then absolutely fine. Don't feel like you have to know the answer to this. And there, again, there is no right answer. But are there particular things you're seeing which are helping donut economics spread as an idea? So a question mark starts off, yeah, maybe we don't understand that yet, and that's something we need to explore. But some other ideas that come out is being adopted by more and more cities, absolutely, which is building that idea of momentum. More information is being shared. The need for change is growing, which creates a greater need for a new idea, a new model. COVID, as an example, yeah, absolutely. These events that can change the system. It's an alternative to a current system. Not sure if it is. Really good point. Is momentum being created? How do we understand that? How do we measure that? Which is definitely something we will be looking at. So more about the fact that there's more exposure, it's being used more, it's offering something different, a solution. But also that the context in which it is emerging is changing, the unfolding disaster, the disparity in wealth and quality of living. Narratives are changing. People are hearing the words but understanding how to implement. Interesting. So that suggests maybe there's a bit of a ceiling to where we can get to with just people understanding it. But more conversation, children, teenagers asking parents, more practical examples emerging, positive action. The old regime needing to change, failing to meet people's needs. Okay, yeah, really interesting. And then some specific examples around what Civic Square are doing in Birmingham, and practical examples that are helping the momentum grow. Again, some really kind of common themes emerging here around the context is changing, the need for it is growing, but also people's understanding of it. Practical examples are emerging. But also some of these questions around, well, is that actually happening? And how do we understand and measure that? Okay, great. One more question before we move on, which is the counterpoint to this question is, what is creating resistance? So what is getting in the way? What is slowing down donut economics being used more widely? What is getting in the way? Okay, wealth. Great, really interesting. Be great to unpack what that means, and the different ways in which wealth might be a barrier. The status quo. Absolutely, yes. So the current system doesn't want to be replaced. So that could be specific. We could talk about, Tories, Conservatives in the UK as an example, the dominant political power, or more generally around privilege. And then we've got ideas of fear coming up in a couple of ways that are really interesting to see. Yes, fear is a huge barrier of change, a huge resistance. And then some specific forces: consumerism, commerce, lobbying, resistance to change, systemic inertia coming up. This idea of inertia, really interesting. Inertia being that force that kind of makes it very hard for things to pick up momentum and to pick up speed, kind of dampens them down. So we'll definitely be reflecting on that when I talk about the tipping points idea. Lack of imagination, really interesting. Again, scared, fear, the emotional side coming into this, which is really, really important. Lack of imagination again. Fossil fuels, dominant powers, the city-Whitehall nexus, again, quite a specific UK context there. But then, so there's again some really interesting themes of the emotional side, the fear around change and around specific change, the loss of power, and the dominant forces, the status quo being a resistance to change. So again, I'm sure we could continue exploring this for a fair bit, but I want to move us on now to think about, okay, well, what is this idea of tipping points then? How do we take all of these ideas where we've started to get into this and then apply it to this framework in particular? So I'm just going to switch to some slides now, and I'm going to talk for about 15-20 minutes around this idea of tipping points, and then we'll hear from Carlotta to start applying this to donut economics in practice. So just some context, this session, this is part of a series that I've been running, looking at applying the positive tipping points framework to different systems and different contexts. So this is the last thematic one, looking at donut economics, and next week I'll be running one which is more of an open space session, exploring where we go from here. So just to put that in some context, then I'll be writing up a report about everything that comes out of that and sharing it with everybody who's signed up to all of the events. So tipping points. So coming back to the first question I asked in the Mentimeter around what do you think of when you think of tipping points? Often what we think about, and the common ideas that come to mind are take two forms. So they tend to be ecological in nature, so relating to the natural world, and they tend to be negative. So here are three examples of tipping points that we know quite a lot about. So on the left, we have deforestation. In the middle, we have glacial melt, ice sheet loss. And on the right, a change in weather systems. So this could be monsoon systems shifting. So these are the kind of tipping points that we're getting better at understanding. Those points at which, if we hit a certain point, we can't escape the effects of this change happening. So even if it hasn't happened yet, we're on a course where it's tipped into a new state and we can no longer avoid that. So these are some of the things we're trying to better understand in order to avoid. So this is a graph that's taken from some research done by David Armstrong McKay from the University of Exeter, looking at how do we take what we know about those negative ecological tipping points and kind of map where we are in relation to them. So this is looking at where might we be if we take various tipping points. GLC, in your message, you can't read the chat, the text, don't worry. I'll move on from this in just a second, but it's looking at specific examples like coral reef die-off, ice loss, glacier loss, monsoon shifts. But what this is really telling us is, with our current trajectory of heating, of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we're on course to hit some of these tipping points quite soon. So even though we won't have seen the worst effects, we will be unable to avoid them. So recently at the University of Exeter, we had a conference which was trying to look at, okay, well, how do we go beyond this? How do we go beyond the negative tipping points and yes, better understand them, but also look at, well, how can we bring tipping points from a positive perspective? Look at them as a potential for positive transformations. So we brought a load of people together who are thinking about these ideas and asked this question of, so what do we do? What do we do now? And the reason I'm sharing this at the beginning is to put it in context of this research is happening right now. So this is very new. This is live. There are people looking at this at the moment. So workshops such as this is all about collecting information to help make sure that that research is as useful as possible. So that's the kind of the context. We're all trying to figure this out at the same time. So positive tipping points. A really key frame to think about this is the idea of what is a complex system. So to talk about the difference between a complex system and a complicated system, I've got this example of a bicycle and a cyclist. So a bicycle is a complicated system. Okay, so it's understandable. There's a right answer. You can take it apart. You can put it back together again. If you pull this particular lever or turn this handle, you know what's going to happen. And you need expertise in order to be able to understand that system. But if we put a person on top of that bicycle, it becomes quite a different thing. It becomes complex. So it's not fully understandable. There is no right answer to how that system is going to function. We might be able to predict some aspects of it, we might know where they're headed. We might know what the traffic is like, but we won't know everything. We won't know their state of mind or what the other road users are going to be doing. We can't fully understand or predict everything that system is going to do. So as well as expertise being useful, we also need multiple perspectives. And the reason I share this at the beginning is because with climate change, and the various interconnected crises we face, these are complex challenges. But what we often do as human beings is take complex things and make them complicated. And that's very understandable because it's very hard to deal with a complex system. And we need to make something complicated in order to be able to write it down, to measure it, to make tangible steps towards it. And that's fine, as long as we don't forget that it is actually complex. So to articulate that a bit better, this is a fabulous cartoon which by someone who works under the name Business Illustrator. And I think it really articulates this idea that we're very good at being in our little box and talking about, yes, we'll go from A to B and this will how this will happen. But every now and then we get that reminder that the real world is a little bit more knotty than that in practice. And so one of the ideas around this positive tipping points idea is, how do we understand and hold that huge complexity of the systems we are trying to change without being completely overwhelmed to the point that we don't feel like we can do anything? And it's a really delicate balance to strike, but that's what this is trying to do, and that's what I'm hoping to communicate. So let's look at an example. This is what's called an S-curve. So we can see it's not a sort of a straight line, but we see over time as something grows, it happens quite slowly, then very quickly, and then sort of plateaus at the end. So this is a helpful way of thinking about how change happens in a more complex way. So we're talking about Doughnut Economics, and we've got our goal at the end here. So this is everywhere is using Doughnut Economics. That is not that end point is not the most interesting moment. That's not the point where we feel like we need to focus on. Really, the key in thinking about momentum and thinking about tipping points is this moment here towards the bottom, just as momentum starts to build and that growth really starts to ramp up. These are the interesting bits. These are the bits where we can start to understand better and better. That's where we're starting to reach a tipping point, where suddenly something goes from facing resistance to having momentum. So this is where the kind of the magic of tipping points happens. To put that again in a bit of context, here's a graph. Don't worry if you can't read it. This is showing is the percentage of people in the US who have a particular technology. And there's a series of different technologies listed on the right, from mobile phones to microwaves to computers to washing machines. But what you can see in these lines is they're not straight lines, but they're all variations on that S-curve, where we get a very sharp, sudden increase, and then things kind of flatten off towards the top. And this tends to be how change happens. It can happen very, very slowly, and then suddenly this new thing can come along and very quickly get adopted. And it's more obvious with technologies, because technologies, it's very easy to see exactly when that thing became available. But the same idea applies for social movements as well, and ideas and concepts such as Doughnut Economics. So this is one of the things we want to start looking at, is how do we better understand these moments? So one thing we can look at is, well, what's happening already in the world? And I want to share the example of electric vehicles because I think it works interestingly on two levels. The first one is it raises this question, well, what is a positive tipping point and what is a negative tipping point? Because for some people, electric vehicles is a really key part of a sustainable future. And for some people, it's not, and it's a distraction, and we need to get more people using public transport, for example. So negative and positive are obviously quite binary words, and we really need to move beyond that. So I think it's important to get that out of the way at the beginning, that there's a lot of subjectivity in this idea. Now, the second reason is, as you can see from this graph here, what this is showing is the percentage of new vehicles that are bought that are electric compared to petrol or diesel. And what this graph is showing us is that Norway is way ahead of the other countries on this list. 64.5% of new cars that are bought are electric versus the next closest, Germany, at 13.6%. So if we think about this, we can start to then question, well, why is this happening? Why is it so far ahead in Norway? And so there's a few things going on, a few conditions. So first of all, well, the price is going down. So the more something is made, the cheaper it can be made. And it's the same with electric vehicles. But again, that's happening pretty much everywhere. So that's not unique to Norway. Quality is going up. So this is another condition that is helping. So as we make something more and more, we get better at making it. So electric vehicles are more reliable. The batteries are better. They perform comparatively better than the alternative that is out there. But again, that's not just unique to Norway. Another thing is the desirability goes up. So the more you see other people driving electric vehicles, the more it feels like a desirable thing to do. So maybe this is starting to explain something of, okay, well, if more people are doing it in Norway, then maybe it seems more desirable. Next one is around accessibility. And Nick's made a really good point in the chat, is that the charging infrastructure is already there in Norway. So absolutely, so this technology is more accessible. People can use it more immediately because there is more charging infrastructure. So again, maybe that's something that's more common in Norway than it is in some of the other countries. But there might also be other things as well. So one thing that Norway have done is brought in taxes on petrol and diesel vehicles so that they become more expensive. So the cost of the alternative to this new behavior is going up. So all of these things are combining, and these are what we call the conditions for change. So it's from these conditions that this new state can emerge, this new state being electric vehicles being the norm, being the thing that people choose to do. But clearly there are also other things going on, and it's more complex than that. But if we map it onto our S-curve, we could interpret it something like, well, maybe Norway, they're not there yet. They're only, 64.5%. There's still a lot of people buying petrol and diesel cars, but there's clearly momentum there. There's clearly momentum behind that movement. Whereas maybe we could put Germany, the next highest, they haven't quite reached that tipping point. They're still at that point where there's a lot of resistance to this change. So this is, again, how we can start to conceptualize and understand what is happening here so that we can apply it to other different ideas. So one crucial thing before I go further is this idea that it can be very tempting when we talk about tipping points to focus on, okay, well, what's the single thing then that we can do that's going to have the most change? Where can we put our lever where we can shift the most amount of change in one go? Because that seems like it's the most easy and appealing thing to do. I'm going to share a quote here from Professor Frank Giles from the University of Manchester, which is from the conference around tipping points, which I think is really important. So what Frank says is the thing that is really appealing to policymakers is the idea that we only have to do something really small and then we see these huge effects, which is pretty misleading because it's primarily the efforts leading up to the tipping point where a lot of effort will actually be needed. And that's a key thing here. And that's the key thing that makes this about conditions and systems. This idea that we need to focus on getting ready for that lever, for that tipping point, if it's actually going to take effect. We can't just focus on that one moment. Everything is about building up to that moment so that when it comes, the change actually emerges. So this is what the tipping point model can look like in its very simplest form. And you can see what we're looking at is how do we move from basin A on the left to basin B on the right, move from one state to another state. And so what you can see this image is representing is we're not focusing on basin B. We're not focusing on that point we want to get to. We're focusing on that point in the middle, the tipping point, because that is the moment where we move from resistance to momentum. So you can see that ball is facing an uphill struggle. It's facing resistance, but once it reaches that tipping point, it starts to gather momentum. And there's a cascade of effects that then tips it into that place we want it to be. So this is where we want to focus on, this point where resistance becomes momentum. So let's think of an example that's in the same ballpark as Doughnut Economics, which is this idea of degrowth. So we're seeing a huge interest in degrowth at the moment. So we've got this, and this is just some examples that I've found some of books about degrowth that have all come out in the last few years. There have been conferences about degrowth that are starting to emerge around the world. These are some headlines that I found from media that you wouldn't necessarily would talk about this idea of degrowth. And so we can start to ask the question, well, are we reaching a tipping point around degrowth? Are we reaching a point where actually that becomes a normal idea? And I think it's easy to say that, well, we're not there yet. You know, there's still a lot of opposition to that. And here's another headline of why degrowth is the worst idea on the planet. So clearly, you know, there's still a lot of resistance there. And I'm not saying this is a good or bad thing, but it's interesting to think, well, where might we be along that journey? Because clearly we're further along than we used to be, but we haven't reached a tipping point yet. But one of the things about this framework is it helps us understand, well, how close might we be? What might we be missing? What else might be needed to push this idea over that tipping point? Because this can work in both directions. So we could find ourselves tipping over into this new system, or we could find ourselves rolling back into basin A, rolling back into where we used to be. And this is where this idea of resistance momentum comes in. We have to overcome all of the resistance if we are going to shift into this new system. So again, you can think about this in terms of Doughnut Economics. Yes, there's a lot of momentum behind it, but there's still a risk that all of a sudden everybody could forget about it and move on to the next thing, and we could go back to square one. Now, it's unlikely that that's going to happen, certainly not overnight, but it's still a risk with any kind of change. And there's two examples here that I've just got of things which could be tipping points, but they could also just be ignored and end up back where we are. And these are climatic changes. So I've got flooding and drought here. So all around the world, we're experiencing these things to differing forms of intensity. And sometimes they lead to change, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes people withstand the flood or the drought, they get over it, they forget about it, and then they tip all the way back into basin A, into that place that they were. So that huge change that could have been a tipping point isn't. And so then we have to ask the question, well, why is that sometimes a tipping point and why is it sometimes not? And one of the answers might be, well, are the conditions there in place to enable that change to happen? If they are, people look to a new idea and they see it emerge and then they can grab hold of it. But if it's not there, then it's likely that the ball is just going to roll back down the hill into that new state of being. We're going to meet that resistance. So this is why it's really important that we understand what is going on in this tipping point model. So a few more slides, and then we'll start thinking about Doughnut Economics in practice. Here's a way we can break down what is happening within this framework. And this is the 3 different stages that we'll look at later on to think about, where is this tipping point? Is it emerging? So this first one is about creating the conditions for change. So we talked a little bit about this earlier, this idea of we need to make sure the things are in place so that that change can emerge in the first place. It can't come out of nowhere. And then the second thing, once we've created those conditions, then we find these reinforcing feedbacks. So reinforcing feedbacks are these things that strengthen those conditions. They make them grow, they make them multiply, they make them stronger. And you can see it's represented here in that image of sort of pushing up that left-hand basin. And you can see that's kind of reducing the level of resistance to move us into this new state. It's literally shifting it up so that there's less resistance to be faced. And then this third point is once we've got those things in place, then we can trigger the change. And this is the thing, this is where there can be one thing that can happen that all of a sudden shifts it up, removes the resistance, turns it into momentum, and then we can shift from one state to another state. But that can't happen in isolation. We have to have those first two stages first. We have to have the conditions, they need to be reinforced, and then that trigger can come in. So let's break that down in a little bit of detail of what that, some examples of what that means in practice. And again, I'll share this later so that we can have a practice with it and think about what it might mean in practice. So the conditions for change. So there's lots of different things that this could be. I've just kind of written out 6 potential examples here. So it could be the number of people. So there's research to suggest that actually if you want change, a smaller population size might help something grow quicker. So it might be that actually if there's a smaller number of people, that change can emerge more quickly. People need to have access to the information, so they need to know what it is that is emerging. Also, this new change, this behavior, this technology, whatever that might be, needs to be affordable. And that can be financial, that could be in terms of time. It needs to be quality. So again, thinking about the electric vehicles, it needs to be something that is as good as, if not better than, the alternative. It needs to be desirable. People need to want to do it. And it needs to be accessible to people. So all of these things are really important conditions for change to actually happen. And then we think about the feedback loops. Okay, so critical mass is a fairly well-known one. So as more and more people do something, it gains a critical mass, and then it just ripples through a population size. So you don't need to get 100% of people doing something. If you can get around 20% of people doing something, then that can become a critical mass where information can spread very quickly. Economies of scale, again, that idea of the more we do something, the cheaper it gets. Learning by doing, the more we do something, the better at it we get. So these are things that are reinforcing these ideas. Coordination, working together. So again, if we're all working in our separate organizations and our separate places, then that doesn't necessarily reinforce these conditions. But if we join together, it can make them stronger. And social networks, which can be literal social networks online, or it can just be how information moves within a community. And then we move on to the triggers. So these are the things where there's that sudden change that can make everything different. So it could be an innovation, a new idea comes out. It could be a new policy from a government that comes in. It could be a sudden change in behavior from a population, or an investment of money or time or capacity in a new idea, or it could be new information that comes in. So again, what we'll do later on is think about, well, how would we apply these to doughnut economics? So we can think about, when we talked about what's growing momentum already, some of the things we talked about were information being shared, more examples coming up. And that idea, I think, taps into this idea of learning by doing, coordination. We can see that it's being reinforced in the places where it's being adopted. More and more people are seeing it. It's being better understood. And in some local places, we might see it's a new policy that comes in from a local government that adopts doughnut economics, that can be a trigger immediately in that area. But we also want to think about, well, what might that be on a global scale rather than just looking individually? Okay, so last thing before I pass on to Carlotta is we also need to think about this in terms of what the alternative might be. So I want you to imagine this image that I've got on the screen here is not in 2 dimensions, but it's in 3 dimensions. So we're rolling this ball to the top of the hill, and it could go where we want it to. It could lead us to this new state, or as we said, it could roll back into basin A if we don't overcome that resistance. But if you think about this in 3 dimensions, if you roll a ball to the top of a hill and then let it go, you can't necessarily completely control where it's going to end up. So we could end up in any one of these alternative systems. And so these alternative new states, some of them might be good, some of them potentially could be better than where we are now, or where we want to be. But some of them could be as bad or worse than where we are now. They could be co-opted by the status quo, by the powers that are already in power, because they recognize a change is coming and they want to shift that change to somewhere that's safer for them. So what this means is when we're thinking about tipping points, one of the most important things to consider is this idea. And I think this is just as true for doughnut economics as it is for anything else, this idea of early warning indicators. So again, this kind of came up briefly in the Mentimeter around regime shift. And these early warning indicators, this is the moment where we start to realize the existing system or regime is losing stability. So change is coming, but we don't necessarily know where that change is going to end up. It could end up where we want it to be, or it could end up somewhere else. So this is why I think this framework is really, really useful, because it's clear that there is a change coming for all of the reasons we listed earlier in the Mentimeter around the cost of living, around the world changing around us. But we really need to be vigilant to, well, what new change is emerging and how do we influence that as much as possible? So that personally, I think we are in that place at the moment, but we can explore that a little bit later on. So again, thinking about it in terms of doughnut economics, are we in that point where there is that sense of change? And if so, what can we do? How do we understand the system to try and shift that new system to be the one we want it to be, one where doughnut economics becomes more and more popular, more and more used, and more understood worldwide? So thanks for bearing with me through that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen there, and I'll catch up on the chat in a few minutes, and we'll have a chance for some clarification questions or more discussion before we get into the breakout sessions later on. But now I'm really keen to hand over to Carlotta, the co-founder and strategy and enterprise lead for the Doughnut Economics Action Lab, to talk to us a little bit about doughnut economics, give a brief reminder for those of us who are a bit more new to it, and then start talking about some of these ideas of where is the momentum appearing, where is the resistance, and then we'll use that to collectively explore how we find the tipping points for doughnut economics. So Carlotta, thanks for joining, and I'll hand over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, first of all, for having me here and also for hosting this space. I find it fascinating, Peter. So thanks so much for giving that introduction. And it's a gift also for Deal and the Deal team to actually have this session and hear from everyone what everyone's sensing around doughnut economics, because of course we that's a lot of what we constantly ask ourselves, right? How can we spread the ideas of doughnut economics at the speed and scale that this time demand? And so that's why Deal exists. And I'm going to be sharing with you briefly some of the core concepts of doughnut economics. And then we'll move into a bit more of what's happening in practice, really. So let me just share my screen and make sure that my screen is it working? Do you see the yellow? Yeah. Brilliant. Okay. 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 And so I'm really gonna dive into the concepts and into the core concepts, because I have a lot to cover in 30 minutes if we want to get into practice. And so for those who don't or are not familiar with doughnut economics or the donuts, I'm just going to bring it in really straight away. And we understand what the starting point of doughnut economics is this image, which is really offering a new compass, a new goal of what it means to thrive for humanity in the 21st century. And so the aim is to leave no one falling short of the essentials of life, and those are within the part in the hole in the middle. So no one should be falling short of water, food, health, education. And all of these were crowdsourced from the world's governments. So we know that every government in the world knows and has agreed that every person has a claim in meeting these essential needs. So we have to leave no one falling short of these essential needs. And at the same time, we cannot overshoot the ecological ceiling. And the ecological ceiling is made out of 9 planetary boundaries that make our Earth's life-supporting systems, and they keep our unique and delicately balanced planet a sweet home for humanity and all the species here with us. So the aim that this image offers is to really meet the needs of people within the means of the living planet. And so live inside the safe and just space of the donut, where people and donut thrive and people and planet thrive in balance. And so with this image, what we see is that we have an amazing opportunity to really rethink or redraw the image of what's the goal of our century, right? So we have the opportunity to really redefine the image with how we understand progress, and we leave behind that never-ending growth of GDP to really find this completely different shape of progress, which is the donut, which means that people and planet are thriving in balance. Now, if that's the goal, we know that we are very far from reaching it. And all this red in this image is showing the extent to which people is falling short of the essentials of life, and the extent to which humanity is in overshoot of planetary boundaries. And so we know that while there is still human deprivation worldwide, we have already collectively exceeded 4 of the planetary boundaries. So the challenge that we have in the 21st century is to eliminate all the red that we're seeing in this page and to enter in the donut from the both sides. So from the social side and from the ecological side. And this has never been done before. So we know that we need new solutions. We know that the 20th century economic theories, the conventional business models, or even traditional development policies were just simply not designed to address this challenge. So, of course, the question is, how do we get into this space? And at the core of Doughnut Economics, what we say is we need to change fundamentally the dynamics of our economies. And we need to leave behind the degenerative industrial system that we've inherited. So we continue to take Earth's materials, make them into stuff. We use them for a while, sometimes only once, and then we throw everything away. And this dynamic of take, make, use, lose is precisely what it's pushing out us out of planetary boundaries. So we need to turn this into a much more cyclical regenerative system where resources are used far more carefully, far more creatively, far more collectively. And so very briefly, just to put some images of what we're talking about, we need to end land degradation. And we need to start restoring the landscape. And how different do these images feel, right? But also industries, we need to stop dumping our waste in the neighborhoods of the world's poorest people. And we need to start really creating the conditions to reuse, repair, share, correct, connect, and create a circular, cyclical, regenerative industrial economy. And we've never done this before. So we're really starting to learn what moving from degenerative to regenerative means in practice. That's one dynamic that we need to change. And then there's another part, which is to recognize that 20th century economies have been designed in many ways through technology, through law, through the way we've designed our enterprises in ways that tend to concentrate value in the hands of a few. And we need to create economies that share far more value, far more equitably amongst everyone who's co-created. So we need economies that are distributive by design. And again, some pictures and some examples of what this could look like in practice. Thinking of housing and how we understand housing, and recognizing that we live in an era of huge housing crisis. In most of the places, we still consider housing as an asset, as an investment asset. And we forget sometimes that it's actually, first and foremost a human right. And it's interesting to see how different places are choosing to understand housing in different ways. And first, we're seeing that to move from that divisive dynamic, we need more examples like the one, for instance, in Vienna. In Vienna, 60% of the residents, they live in social housing, which is owned by the city municipality or by subsidized cooperatives, meaning that houses have got a much more affordable rent, they're central, they're good quality. And so it's just showing how different outcomes can come out of very different decisions of what a city's considerations of what housing really means and stands there, and therefore how it's owned and managed. But also businesses. We've inherited a mindset in the last century that where the purpose of business is just to make profits. So the purpose of business is business. And well, there's a lot more to that. And so the question is, how can we create and how can we design our businesses in a way that are here really for something much bigger, right? To generate much more social and ecological community benefits, and so help us coming into that space of the donuts. So from degenerative to regenerative, from divisive to distributive, these are some of the very core ideas of Doughnut Economics. And all of these were beautifully described by my colleague Kate Raworth in the book Doughnut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. And the book had, as we all know, a lot of traction and resonance among so many different areas of practice, different change makers all around the world just started to pick up the concepts and the book and started to put the ideas into practice so playfully, so creatively. And so it was very clear, 3 years ago when I met Kate, clearly the ideas wanted to jump off the page. And it was really much inspired from these change makers that we decided to co-found Doughnut Economics Action Lab to precisely work with that emergent community of practitioners. So we always say that our name is very intentional. So we created Deal to really move from ideas to action. And we did it in a very, with a very intentional spirit of experimentation. So really, how can we learn with and from others? What would it mean to co-create a new economy? And so in a very big nutshell, what we're doing is we're working with change makers worldwide who are turning the ideas of Doughnut Economics into practice and are aiming to really bring transformative and systemic change. And we're doing it across different areas of practice. So we've got what we call our 6 themes. We're working with cities and regions, so all the local governments at the many scales, from villages to mega cities, that they're all adopting in very different ways the tools and concepts of Doughnut Economics. But also communities and people in the neighborhoods, in their lives, in their communities, from the household to the street to the neighborhood, just exploring what would it mean to bring these ideas to help them envision a new future. Schools, so much energy around bringing and teaching these ideas into school. But also in business, right? We are very keen to start working a bit more with really brave and progressive businesses that really want to redesign their deep design and to enable regenerative and distributive outcomes. Working also with researchers and more trying to think, how can we open a space for the many students that really want to do more research with the ideas of Doughnut Economics. And government and policy, a bit more of the responsive work that we do at a more national level. Whenever there is an interesting and strategic opportunity, we'll respond to some national inquiries. And so I'm going to be diving into the space, especially of cities and communities, because I would say that a lot of the momentum of the interest that we've seen since we started was precisely at the local level, at the place-based transformation. So we know that the donut is a global concept, and so we started really putting it into action by downscaling it into a much local level. But before I do that, I want to very briefly also share with you some of the, let's say, we call them strategic principles, which are guiding the way in which we shape and we evolve our work at Deal. So we've adopted a very much emergent strategy, which means that we're really responding to what is emerging once we've put these ideas out there. And what we do is we hold these principles to ourselves that really guide us in the way we're taking these ideas into the world. And I think they're really, I'm bringing them here because I think they're really interesting to understand that these principles and how these might be or might not be helping us to get to that positive tipping point, right? So we're going to the where the energy is, and we've always said that. And I think this principle really comes from the history or just the recognition that Kate wrote Doughnut Economics with the ambition to really change the curriculum that was taught on the economics courses. So it was all about transforming economic theories and thinking. But when the book was there, the truth is that the energy was not coming precisely not from economic department. So it was not coming from the theoreticians, right? It was coming from the practitioners. It was coming from city councils. It was coming from community organizations, designers, entrepreneurs. So the theoreticians, as I'm saying, didn't really respond immediately, but practitioners did. So this idea of working with practice and with change makers in the ground has really underpinned a lot of our strategic approach. And we always say that 21st century economics will be practice first and theorize later. And that's where we're really focusing our energy, right, across the different fields that we're working. But also being a small team, we've always followed the principle of really like not knocking on closed doors. We just can't be doing that. We really want to focus on working with those who really find these ideas already useful and that want to use them to bring about transformative change in their places. And there is many. So this principle also makes us or really allows us to recognize that there's so many other worldviews and so many other frameworks as well, offering pathways towards amazing regenerative and distributive economy, as well as Doughnut Economics. And so we're not motivated to try and persuade people to use this particular framework, but really rather respond where there is energy in a place around it. So what we're seeing is that it's every change maker, every teacher, every local counselor, every community organizer, they are in the best position to really judge whether in their local context, these ideas and these tools are useful. And if so, then we respond to it. So we're going with the energies, and we are focusing most of our energy in creating playful, irresistible, accessible tools that turn Doughnut Economics into practice. And we are inviting others to innovate and to adapt with them in their own context. So a lot of what we do is to really share these tools in the commons so that everyone can pick them up and start to explore them in their places. And we're delighted to see the many ways that practitioners are choosing to put these concepts into practice. So a lot of openness in the way we've approached Doughnut Economics into practice, but at the same time, we've also been very careful in defining boundaries to protect the integrity of the concepts, to ensure that they don't get misused or watered down, co-opted. And so everyone in the community is asked to really follow some principles in return, right? So everyone can use the concepts, can use the tools, but please follow Doughnut principles of practice to make sure that we are really stewarding the integrity of the initial ideas. But also, what we've seen is that there are some areas that we had to be a bit more careful. And of course, one of them has been businesses. So business was one of the areas where we really saw that the concept was perhaps at most risk of maybe getting co-opted, greenwashed. And so we always said, well, when a radical idea like the donut meets business as usual, one of them is going to be transformed, and we need to be very sure that it's indeed business as usual that gets transformed, not the other way around. And so we've been really careful. You might have followed a bit of the story behind how we've opened this space of work. In fact, I'm very, very thrilled to say finally now to come into a presentation and say, well, we've opened this space. So for the past year, we've worked closely with enterprises, with members in the community, really creating the tools or the core tool for business, which is consistent, or we believe is consistent with the transformative ambition that the Doughnut and Doughnut Economics offers. We just launched this tool a few weeks ago, and so we're just extremely excited to see what's the energy that is going to emerge from it. Because at Deal, we've always believed that the extent to which businesses can really undertake this transformation does not depend on the design of the products or the services alone, but it really depends on the design of the enterprise itself. And so this tool that we've created focuses on addressing the deep design of an enterprise as a mean to bring about the business outcomes and practices and investments that we want to see if we indeed want to have regenerative and distributive outcomes. So really exciting about bringing that tool, and again, really keeping that integrity, or trying to keep and to safeguard that integrity. What we've published also, it's a policy alongside the tool, which sets out some conditions on how this tool can be used. And so we're not creating a certification. We're not asking for any fee for these tools to be used, but what we're really trying is to put these tools in the commons and really work with those who share our values and share the ambition and really the ambition for transformative change, and therefore really want to help us steward and protect the integrity of the concepts. And so we really want to learn from everyone who's really having that commitment of what it takes to really spread these ideas wide, but also keep that integrity. So we will continuously seek to balance that commitment to really being open and really share and adapt the tools that we create, with the commitment of really keeping the transformative ambition of the principles at the heart of Doughnut Economics. And we want to unleash the power of peer-to-peer inspiration. I mean, I think that's been really powerful also for us to really see how important it is. And we believe that the most inspiring person might actually be someone just by yourself, who is already doing something that you thought you could, but you couldn't, but you actually, by seeing it, you can imagine it, and therefore you act, right? And you get inspired. And that's what we've been seeing since we launched Deal. It was quite impressive when Amsterdam in 2020 adopted publicly the framework. That really triggered an amazing interest across many different governments that started to reaching out, that they wanted to really start to explore the ideas in a similar ways. And so it was just, it really evidenced what we thought could be a good way, right, to really focus our energy in creating that inspiration. And so it is so important for us to continue to highlight and celebrate the innovations that are coming through the Deal community, because we know that they can create big ripples. And we know that our starting point, it's big teamwork. So it takes a rich ecosystem of actors and alliances. And so we see really our work really aiming to create tools that can be integrated and incorporated with others, and recognizing other narratives, other framings from other cultures and other traditions that really complement and connect with Doughnut Economics. And so building these relationships and mutual recognition is really part of the strategy, that how we're bringing these ideas into the world. So yeah, really not trying to be the movement, but really joining that movement. And I'm gonna now move into the last part of my presentation, which is sharing a bit of what we've done at a city level, because as I said, that's where we started. That's where we clearly saw energy coming. When I first started working with Kate, Amsterdam was really starting to get interested, but also the C4 team got in touch, really wanting to explore what would it mean to really downscale with different cities, the methodology. So it was really interesting to just spot that energy and momentum, and we focus our energy at the beginning to create the basic or the core tools to downscale the global concept of the donut to a place. And so the starting question that we asked ourselves, well, how can our city help bring humanity into the donuts? And so we've unrolled it, and we've created this space to reimagine and to really bring the social foundation together with ecological ceiling, but also thinking what it means to thrive here in our city and our relationship with the rest of the living world. And so we've created the framework, which has a really ambitious question at its heart. And we're asking this question to every city, every place that approaches us. And I'm going to invite you to listen to it from the lens of the place where you're living. So how can our city become a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people in the world and the health of the whole planet? And so it breaks down into 4 questions. So it has a local social, a local ecological, a global social, global ecological angle. And the 4 lenses bring about what we're calling a city portrait. I'm not gonna deep dive into each of the questions because we just don't have time now. I'm just gonna simply bring them here for the spirit of having them present. So how can all the people of our city thrive? That's the first question that we ask. And of course, it can only be answered by the people in that place. And then the second question puts the place or the city in its natural habitat. And we ask every city, well, how can our city be as generous as the wildland next door? Now, these 2 questions are setting the aspirations of being a thriving place, right? They're local aspirations, but we need to put these local aspirations in the context of a much wider responsibility. And so that's why we ask as well, how can our city respect the health of the whole planet? But not only the health of the planet, but also the health of the people, right? So how can our city respect the well-being of all people that are being impacted by the ways in which we live here? So these 4 lenses make up what we call, as I'm saying, the city portrait. And what we're seeing, or what we saw since we've shared these tools, is that many places, many cities around the world have started to pick up these tools, these concepts, and started to explore them and put them into practice in many different ways. And for most of the cases, these 4 lenses have been really the starting point of the processes, of the conversations, and not only happening at cities, but also happening at different scales. I saw Civic Square is a beautiful example of a neighborhood scale, exploration, innovation, but we've got also regions. And what would it mean to actually scale it up, right? So, yeah, it's been, as I say, huge traction and huge interest from the place-based space, as I say, from local governments on the one side. So we've been seeing really a lot of local administrations engaging with Doughnut Economics. And from this practice, we're starting to identify some emergent patterns of the ways that cities are choosing to work with Doughnut Economics. So we're seeing how it's being used as guiding frameworks to set new visions, strategies, but also as a tool for really more day-to-day decision-making processes, but also just used to break silos and build coherency. We're seeing a lot of that, and also as a way of really bringing different stakeholders to create collective visions that many times it's so difficult as cities really work in such a complex and siloed way. But this is not only happening from local governments. So a lot of those places and those initiatives that I've shown are coming from the community level. So we're seeing communities and networks really coming together and using these tools as a way of visioning and also a way of convening, connecting, sharing, just making visible the change that is happening already in their place. And we're really excited. We're really excited to see that there's a really interesting diversity of ways in which these ideas are being put in practice, but also who's starting, right? And also starting to learn what happens where there's energy across different levels in a place, right? So to finish, some specific examples that I brought here, and again, more and more, we're collecting those stories so that we can share them more, but I've brought here 4. Amsterdam, maybe the most probably publicly known. They were the first to go public about it, so there was a lot of public resonance with it, and it's been amazing to be in a journey with Amsterdam, really a learning journey of what it means for a city to really embrace this in the city, but also working along with the people in the ground, right? So we saw that the city council really adopted the donuts to guide the way in which they were designing their circular strategy. So having a much more holistic circularity strategy. And at the same time, so many initiatives in the ground led by the Amsterdam Doughnut Coalition, who emerged as well at the time and who continues to really drive change from the ground, and really we're starting to learn what it takes, right, to build the relationships between the city councils and the more community-led activities which continue to happen. So yeah, amazing journey with Amsterdam continues to be a source of learning and inspiration for the whole community. Barcelona, Barcelona, it's been great to see them as well, the city council really embracing the challenge of creating a city portrait, starting with a much more, let's say, desk-based approach, but now really opening it to the city and inviting conversations with residents. And they're starting to move on into building the metrics to really deep dive into different thematics or themes. So we're really kind of waiting to see where they want to take this work forward. But it is also a place that is showing a lot of those conditions that are really interesting to observe and see what patterns emerge after this. A couple of community-led initiatives, so not government-led. For instance, Leeds, that's a beautiful example actually of how a civic organization together with a university, they've created and they've done this report that explores the four lenses of the city, and they launched it through a workshop. They brought together people in the city. So really, again, an amazing example of a more community-led initiative of putting the ideas into their context. And Birmingham Civic Square, and it's been mentioned here already today. My goodness, what a place to go and to really get inspired. They've been really taking this to a completely different level and exploring what it means to really bring these ideas to the neighborhood level. So really going into such a deep journey of learning and education and discussion with the residents, with the children, with the young people in this community of what it means to really thrive within the means of the living planet. So many initiatives we're seeing. It's been 3 years. We're seeing all of these popping up. We're of course thrilled to see the uptake, and of course we continue. I mean, we continue to ask ourselves, how can we continue to design, deal, and this work in a way that really helps us spread far, wide, but also with integrity, right? So that we can, really we can make this hopefully a way of creating systemic change. And I'm gonna just finish just bringing also some of the challenging questions that we've brought. And I love how, Peter, you already started asking, what's stopping us and what's stopping Doughnut Economics. And to be honest, I'd love to learn from what you're all seeing. I'm just bringing here a few of the questions that we constantly ask ourselves and that we are seeing as challenging questions, very alive for our work. So for instance, in cities, will those initiatives, every city that has embraced the donuts throughout these initial years, how will they go beyond their election cycles? So will they endure beyond those election cycles? Really curious to see what happens and to learn of what really happens when a radical idea like Doughnut Economics, like meets the reality of the systems that we live in. But also the question about integrity. And so how can we make sure that these ideas don't get co-opted? And therefore, like we always think that could definitely stop the momentum, and that could definitely stop, the big vision that the donut brings. So we constantly ask ourselves, are we striking the right balance between openness and integrity? But also, of course, much bigger question and quite out of our control. How will a crisis, national, global crisis, reinforce or undermine engagement and action? And we're seeing it right now, how cities are choosing to respond to those crises are definitely going to have a say. And then there's a couple of maybe more internal questions for us, but we continue to ask ourselves, well, how will the wider ecosystem of change makers that are doing this work as well get access to funding to do this work? So how can we make sure that the ecosystem of change makers working in this work have the support to effectively do the work? And then, of course, how and will Doughnut Economics spread beyond places and communities in the so-called Global North? We are a predominantly Europe-centric organization and team. And so it's a constant question that we bring ourselves, how can we respond to the energy elsewhere, but also connect where the energy is elsewhere, and yeah, how can we find that balance? So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I think we have some time to discuss, and I hope this has been interesting. And for those who don't know the platform, I really invite you to visit us. This is the platform where we've trying to connect and bring together every change maker and different groups and organizations that are putting these ideas into action. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Carlotta. That was fascinating, and a really lovely articulation, I think, of how the Doughnut Economics model and the way it's emerging is already links quite nicely to this idea of positive tipping points. So many of the things you talked about, the principles, the peer-to-peer inspiration, the joining the movement rather than being the movement, these, I think, all are great examples of reinforcing feedback loops of, you're kind of waiting for that thing to emerge. You're not trying to control it too much, because we can't control change on such a big scale. But what we can do is create the conditions, reinforce them, build them up, share them, so that when that change is ready, it can take root. And I think that's a really great example of why I think this framework can be a really powerful tool, is because it doesn't rely on us to have the answer of, well, how exactly do we get to that point? Because we don't know, and things are going to change over time. But if we can reflect on what we're doing as being part of supporting the ecosystem to be in the right place, ready to respond to that trigger, to that change, I think that's a really powerful idea. So we've got about 45 minutes left, and we've been talking at you for a while, and really appreciate your attention and some of the really interesting conversation going on in the chat. What I want to do now is to put us into just a small number of breakout rooms to start exploring this in a bit more detail, and we're going to do this twice. And the first question I want to pose is for us to think about. Let's start at the end, start at the finish, this idea of triggers. So this question of, okay, well, what could happen tomorrow or the day after or at some point in the next year, a thing that could happen that would enable Doughnut Economics to suddenly become, grow hugely in scale and to become normalized. And that can be at a local level or a global level. And I want to invite you to use your imagination, let go of every but, what if, we can't do that because. We're not focusing on that now. What we want to do is just start and think, what might those triggers be? What could happen? Because what we'll then do after that, after we've shared some ideas, think about, well, if they did happen tomorrow, would we be ready for them? And I think that will help us unpick some of this idea of what might the conditions be, and are they in place ready, or are there some gaps that we need to fill? So what I would, I'm just going to share my screen and show you. I'm going to give you a link to Jamboard, which if you haven't used before, don't worry, there's absolutely no obligation to use this. It's just a tool to record some notes if you want. And what you can do is you can click on this sticky note and write an idea down, and then that creates a little note that you can move around the screen. So what we're going to do is focus on this bottom area, triggers for system change, in this first one, and you can see there's you can use these arrows to move between breakout groups to find the one that you're in. As I say, if you're comfortable with that, please do use it, and if you're not, don't worry about it. The key thing is that you have that conversation. So I'll just put a link to that in the chat. So we'll have about just about 10 minutes on this, because I think it's really good that we'll just get some ideas generated in your group. Then we'll come back, see what's come out of it, and then go back and have a little bit of a more in-depth conversation about well, how likely might these things be? How, if they happen, would we be ready for them? And we can have more of a discussion there. If anybody wants to get into any more detail, we can have space for that as well. So I'll open the breakout rooms. If anyone's got any questions, please do feel free to ask, and I can come in and help if there's any technical issues or anything like that. But what I want to do, I'm just going to open those rooms now. Let me know if you've got any questions, and I'll bring you back in about 10 minutes time. So remember, the question here is, what might the triggers be for doughnut economics becoming the norm? What could happen tomorrow? What's the thing that might happen that would enable that to be the case? So just ideas, don't worry about how it would happen, just what might that thing be? So enjoy, and I'll see you in about 10 minutes. It's fascinating to see the notes that are coming up in the Jamboards from the groups that were using that tool. I'd love to hear some examples or any things that came up that felt particularly interesting to share of what might these triggers be. What are the things that, if they happened? There were some really interesting ideas, but does anybody want to share any of the thoughts that they had or that came up in their group? No pressure. I can read a couple out, but if anybody wants to,
I don't mind wading in.
Thanks, Fiona. Over to you.
We sort of talked about two things, which is where we got cut off in the middle of the conversation, was this notion of needing something like catastrophe to kind of enact change, but then also like this notion that actually we're kind of in that space, but maybe that the clarity of the issues isn't there. So actually we are, having issues with deaths related around, climate, but it's like all of our kind of points become kind of connected in that way, because actually that's all about information and how we choose to kind of to talk about the problems that we're experiencing, and the kind of clarity from media and government around those issues.
Thanks, Fiona. I think that's a great example and a really interesting one around, it feels like, yeah, we're in that catastrophe now, so why isn't that, the trigger for change? But I think that's why then when we think about, well, are those conditions in place? Because if we can feel that the world is changing around us and we can see a new option emerging in front of us, then it's easy for that resistance to become momentum, because there's something waiting for it. There's a new system waiting. Whereas if there isn't one, then there's much more resistance faced. And so, yes, we kind of fall back into the way we've always done things, or the kind of the business as usual model. So I think it's a great example of the trigger is important, but that new opportunity, that new system needs to be in place. Those conditions need to be there. Any other ideas that anyone wanted to share? A couple of really good examples of talking about electoral reform. There was one comment which I thought was fascinating, of just peace. The word peace, I think, is a lovely trigger. Okay, if that peace suddenly happened, what would that mean? And so, I mean, again, we could kind of talk about this for a bit more, but I really wanted to I'll move us back into the rooms. And the question now is, okay, so yeah, if these things happened, would we be ready? And Fiona, I think you were just kind of getting onto that point already. So if your group has already been talking about this, then keep it going and see where that goes. Would we be ready for doughnut economics to fill that gap, to become normalized, to become the dominant model that is used by communities and governments and everyone everywhere? And so here the invitation is to talk about both, well, yeah, what's in place? What are the conditions for change that are there? What are the feedback loops that are in place? But also what's missing? What is not there? And maybe you can also touch on, which has come through the chat a little bit, this idea of the dampening feedbacks or the resistant feedbacks. What are the things in place that are keeping the status quo as the dominant force? So really that question, and you can talk about it generally, you can take each individual post-it note and think about it in different, if that thing happened, would Doughnut Economics be ready? As Carlotta talked about, Deal has been in existence for a few years. Doughnut Economics as a concept has been in existence for a few years before that. So it's clearly building up that momentum. But if those triggers happened now, would we be ready collectively, globally, regionally, locally for that change to be there? So again, there's no right or wrong answer to that, but I'm going to give you another 10, 12 minutes to think about that and really explore that idea of what's ready, what about the system, what conditions are there, but also what things are absent. And then we'll come back, share some ideas, and then think about wrapping up next steps, and we can talk more about where the positive tipping points idea is going. So I'll send you back into the rooms and I'll see you again in about 12 minutes or so. Thank you for that. Some really interesting things in the on the Jamboard. So we've got about 15 minutes left, and I'm really keen that we kind of just open the discussion now. So in a minute, I'll check if anybody wants to share anything that came out of their group, but also invite any broader questions, comments, reflections, ideas around this idea and reflecting on the context that Carlotta shared earlier. But I think one of the things, just to emphasize, this has been a really whistle-stop tour through the framework, and there's obviously loads more we could delve into. But really hope with this framework, one of the things it starts to do is help us understand how we can all locate ourselves within the work for change. So there are all things we can all do at any level of scale that we're working on that can be contributing for these conditions, that can be supporting these feedback loops. So I think that's one of the things that'd be really great to draw out of this of these last few minutes. But does anybody want to share anything that came from their discussion, or more broadly? It'd be great to open this up so you don't have to just listen to my voice for the last 10 minutes or so as we're here. So open invitation for any reflections or comments or questions.
Well, I'll pitch in and say something about what we talked about. Somebody mentioned electoral reform. You quoted them, Peter, in the last break, and we talked a bit about local government, and I was talking about Frome town in Somerset, where they have this flat pack democracy. You might want to note that term if you're not familiar with it, because there's been a book written about it. Basically, what they've done in Frome is pretty effectively taken political parties out of local government within the town. Because what happens in local government in towns in England is that people vote with their party. And even if they don't necessarily think it's the right thing for the town, if the party says this is what we're going to do at a local level, this is all decided at a local level, but obviously influenced by what's going on nationally, then that's how they vote by default. And that's why so many really rubbish decisions get made. And in Frome, they've managed to take that out of the equation, and they're operating on a basis that the councillors are there for the good of the town, and they do not vote with their party, if they have a party at all. Mostly they're independents. And that's working, and it's worked really well for Frome, and it's meant that all sorts of things, they've been able to have conversations about what might be good for the town, what's not good about the town, what could we do to change things in the way that the Doughnut Economics so brilliantly describes. It's the beginning of a conversation. So I threw that into our first session because I thought that in itself was a trigger. I was then asked, well, what triggered that to happen, which was a very good question. And I didn't actually really have an answer to that, except I knew that there were a lot. The town was pretty run down 20, 30 years ago. There was a lot of cheap property. There were young people moving in with different ideas, and things came together. Something needed to be done. There was a crisis in the town, in a sense, just as there is in many small market towns all over the country, and they managed to get something going there. So I think that's interesting. I think proportional representation we should be fighting for, because the two-party system doesn't work. My only other comment would be, we live in a very binary kind of world where people go, well, you can't trust government, we've got to do it ourselves. And then other people say, no, we must focus on government. We have to do both. All of this has to work on so many different levels. And we don't have time to create the perfect solution. We just have to influence things at every possible level right now. So that's just my thoughts.
Thanks, Phil. I think that's really beautifully articulated, and certainly that last point, we have to do both, to me I think gets to the core of the idea of positive tipping points, as well as we have to focus on those triggers, those big changes, but we also have to build up the conditions for change at the same time. And we don't individually have to take responsibility for both of those things, but we can see it collectively. So if we are all supporting the system to shift, but we're also working towards electoral reform, those big changes that could trigger the shifts that we need. I think that collective power is so important in this, and that's something that's quite hard to conceptualize sometimes, and easy to feel overwhelmed by. So yeah, really nice example. And Fiona kind of makes the point that government isn't nimble enough to be leading change on its own. Absolutely, we can't rely on one part of the system to be doing this. It's applying pressure at different points. As Mamadine says, to get that leverage. So any other comments or reflections or thoughts or questions following on from that, or going off in a slightly different tangent?
Would anyone in team 3 be able to explain a bit more about the network building? It sounds really interesting.
I'm happy to. I've been a little involved in SCAN, the Scottish Community Climate Action Network. After COP26, Scottish Government have ceased and stopped the £10 million a year Community Climate Action Fund, which for 10, 12 years was dispersed to community-led initiatives across Scotland, which ran from about 2008 to 2020. Yes, earlier this year. The new idea they've got, it's a bit top down, but never mind. It's actual cash is evidenced by 2 Pathfinder community climate action hubs, which have been set up in northeast Scotland around Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire. And these are employing 4 people, offering micro grants for community-led initiatives. What's quite interesting is that it's, although it's top down, the groups making a bid for it, like Fife, the county of Fife Community Climate Action Network, they're next in line. They have to evidence that they've got full civil society backing. And so that's a good opportunity. And there's a link in the Jamboard. I'll put it in the in the chat as well.
Thanks, David, for sharing that. Again, a great example of how networks can help shift the system. And I think also a good example, you talk about the top-down investment, which is it could be an example of a tipping point, but that wouldn't have come if the conditions weren't there by the work the network had been building. Did you want to add something else to that?
Yes, I suppose it's got many parallels to the network of climate emergency centres, which are physical spaces. We had a comment in our breakout group about how people need to just get together, and of course we're very atomized by all this whole process. So in England, the climate emergency centres network, which is really extensive, and lots of local initiatives have taken that. They become a practical location where people can meet. There can be some sort of locus for focus, and that's where Doughnut Economics can be introduced as a process, as a tool to enable people to process, to understand how to engage, or how to put their shoulders to the wheel in terms of change making. And this is the biggest difficulty, is that we just feel disempowered. So many people feel wholly overwhelmed. And Doughnut Economics, as far as I can see, and a good example is Sustaining Dunbar. They've adopted it within their local group as a process, as a framework, which helps them to understand how they can advocate for sustainable development. I mean, it goes back to 72, you know, to years and years. It's all about the three-legged stool, about trying to make the balance between ecology, social, economic drivers. Thanks.
Thanks, David. And Mohammed, I see you put in the chat about radical inclusion. Did you want to say, would you able to say a little bit about that? Because I think that's a really important aspect that we haven't maybe touched on just yet. Sorry to put you on the spot. Feel free to.
I'm not going to claim to be any kind of expert on this. It's just that a common thread that's just turned up time and time again is that the nature of the thing that we're kind of all collectively working against is that we've all been systematically excluded from having any kind of meaningful participation in the things that affect our lives. We don't have a real say in work, we don't have a real say in our localities, and we don't have a real say at a government level, let alone on the international scale. And we need to turn it around totally. Everybody needs to be represented, everybody needs to be able to show up and actually have their actual say and be included. Everybody needs to be consulted. And we need to make that the default rather than just the exception. We need to find ways to do that somehow.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mohammed. I think that's such an important point to bring in, and really good that's come right at the end, because I think it also highlights that idea that when we're talking about something like Doughnut Economics, and we talked very, very early at the start about what Doughnut Economics could mean if it was adopted more widely, and a lot about justice and fairness and sustainability. But I think the way you've just articulated there emphasizes the idea that any action that supports radical inclusion, that opposes that systematic exclusion that you talked about, is contributing to the conditions for change that will allow things like Doughnut Economics to emerge and to flourish. And not just Doughnut Economics, a lot of the other things that are also going on in collaboration, that movement that Carlotta talked about being part of rather than having ownership over. And I think that's why this framework, I think, can be so powerful in helping us recognize how any action that we do that supports these conditions to flourish, that reinforces them, is acting towards that systemic change. Even if we feel like we can't influence on our own, we can't control the triggers, we can't make there be electoral reform overnight, we can still all collectively contribute. And I think it's such a powerful way to recognize the impact that we all have collectively. And again, just some great examples going on in the chat as well. I'm really conscious we're at 2 minutes to 12:30, and I do want to finish on time. I appreciate you all staying around to the end. In a second, Carlotta, I'll just come to you if you want to add any reflections before we finish. But just to say, as I mentioned at the beginning, this research into tipping points is live. It's going on right now. And it's really important that we have voices that are not just academic voices as part of that conversation, that it's not just happening at an academic level, that we really test out this model. Does it work for communities? Does it work for local businesses, for governments around the world? And so I'll be feeding back everything that comes out of this to the ongoing research conversation that is happening. But I'll share loads of more links and resources in the follow-up email to this, links to Jamboard, links that come out in the chat, and other information you can find. But I welcome you to do get in touch, be part of the conversation, and we'll keep you updated at ways to not just contribute to the conversation, but I think help decide where it goes as well, because I think that's really important. And we've just scratched the surface this evening, but hopefully it's given you a bit of interest in this idea, in this model, and the potential that it could have. And it's certainly been incredibly valuable for me to hear all of the ideas that have come out. So Carlotta, I'll just pass to you before we close.
Sure. Well, likewise, it's been fascinating to hear the people in my group, but also just now I was just going through the Jamboard, and there's so much there that certainly is valuable for me as well. And I'd love to actually yeah, take some of the reflections, but also Peter, if you could share, of course, a bit of that framework. So I think it's a very valuable framework to really help us reflect where we are, and as I was saying, we're just seeing patterns, and so it's great for us to stop and actually reflect on what we're seeing, and a framework like this certainly helps. Yeah, just huge thanks. It's just really valuable, as I say, just hearing from what everyone's sensing. And again, just to recognize, we're talking about Doughnut Economics, and I want to end up in that note, and I've said it in my presentation, it's Doughnut Economics in the context of so many other ideas and concepts that are contributing to this paradigm shift that I think we're all aiming for, and the donut represents it in a way that some people find it really useful, and I find it very useful, and some others don't. And so how can we more just complement with all the powerful concepts and frameworks, and what are the conditions that we need to put so other frameworks also that maybe are more useful for other contexts or other other contexts and cultures also can flourish in a way that maybe Doughnut Economics is doing as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carlotta. Beautifully put. And on that note, thank you so much, everyone, for coming, for really participating in the session, in the discussion. So many great ideas. I'll capture everything that's come out in the chat. I'll share links to the Jamboard again and to the recording and all of the other resources in the follow-up email, which I'll get to as soon as I can. But really appreciate you giving us your time. Lovely to see everybody, and I hope you stay part of the conversation around tipping points, because it's vital that we have input from all levels of scale and all places around the world.